Brent, it comes to us from the psychology department at John Jay, and also from gender studies. And I first heard of your work actually on Stop and Frisk some time ago, which which was pretty brave, to be doing that kind of research in New York. And so now is going to talk to us today about interrupting, seeing and interrupting privilege at an elite private school. My only hope is that it's not my son's.
I don't know. That's a good point. Okay.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks to the Center for Study on Men and Masculinities and all of you for inviting me and coming here on a Friday, particularly when it's nice out. So I looked online. You have a great website to be admired, and you film. Yeah, and you film this, and so I looked at. I wasn't sure what to expect. I didn't know how many would come, and when I looked at who came, the talk seemed rather formal, and so I wrote a formal talk. But it can be less formal, and if you have any questions or you'd like to add some comments or whatever, we can go back and forth. But I'll give my formal talk, and then feel free to interrupt me or let's start a discussion. Let me get my clicker. I'm a social psychologist by training, though, as Michael said, I'm in the psychology department at John Jay College, but I'm actually the gender studies hire. They're first at John Jay. It's a new program. And I spend a lot of my time in the environmental psychology at the Graduate Center just up the street. My interests throughout all of my research involved the social psychology of oppression. As a social psychologist, I'm particularly interested in just globally the idea of oppression. And so my primary research questions involve the following. One, how are institutional and systemic privileges reproduced and oppression maintained? Two, where are the ideologies and structures that sustain these arrangements? And then three, to what extent can participatory research crafted within local communities interrupt normalized practices of oppression and the accumulation of privilege? That last one I'm going to spend a little time on because as a feminist methodology, I do all of my work, no matter where I am, has to do with participatory action research. And so I don't know, maybe some of the ethnographers or some others know about participatory research or PAR, but I'm just going to go into it for those who don't know that much about it, just to explain what the standpoint is. The largest bulk of my work, sorry, I did that one. The largest bulk of my work over the last 6-7 years has been devoted to examining gender and violence, with a special interest in problematizing heteronormative masculinities and investigating the enactments of hegemonic masculinities, its ideological justifications, its consequences, and what happens when hegemonic masculinities are challenged by critical research. The problem as a psychologist, the problem with psychology is that we tend to be really myopic. And I know I'm not speaking to psychologists, or I guess I am a little bit. We tend to be myopic in method, we tend to be myopic in theory. We're often too focused on the individual. We, as a result, create deficit narratives. We tend to not capture systemic relationships. We tend not to pay attention to structure, institutions, and cultures. And so, in my work, I try to do better, maybe more like the sociologist in the room or the anthropologist. And usually, in talks like this, I then describe some of my standpoint, but I'm pretty sure I'm in good company, and I don't need to detail that today. But I will just say the following. My work is influenced by critical race and feminist theory. I've been heavily influenced by Michael Kimmel on a whole range of things, including your work on homophobia. I also use your textbook, which is wonderful in my intro class. The second chapter on biology has saved me each semester. People really get into that. I've been influenced by Connell's work. I've been influenced by the concept, obviously, of hegemonic masculinity and masculinities as plural. I've been particularly influenced by Crenshaw, Colin Stewart, Hurtado, Michelle Fine, and their understanding of positionality and intersectionality. Willis, Ferguson on power and hierarchy. And so this is where I situate my intellectual thinking and where this work is going to be. But obviously, as I've mentioned, my interest is in the psychology, the social psychology of oppression. I situate gender within the framework of oppression and privilege. Privilege and oppression as systemically connected, one systematic or excuse me, systemic advantage is another's disadvantage. We're in a knot, and then consequently we need to study both. Both the oppression and the privilege of this knot. So I've examined gender and violence in a number of contexts with different methodologies, qualitative and quantitative, in Nepal and Afghanistan, in healthcare contexts, with men who stuttered and used the internet as a form for emotional expression. I spent the last 4 years, as Michael was mentioning, in the Bronx and in Brooklyn, working with mothers and their sons on their experiences and attitudes towards police, particularly around stop and frisk. But as advertised, I'm going to focus on work I had done. They're sort of overlapping, but it was about 3 to 5 years of work, sort of ethnographic work, on violence in a really elite, all-boys school, and I call it the Rockport bullying study, and I call the school Rockport. It's not actually Rockport, but that's what I'll be calling it. This work came out of an organization that you should all know about. It's been in existence now for 10 years. It's called the Center for the Study of Boys and Girls' Lives, and it's in association with the University of Pennsylvania and the School of Education. I, at the time of doing this work, was the director of boys research. The entire director is a very well-known masculinity scholar, Michael Reichert, and I highly recommend.
He's well known to us. He comes to our meetings.
Oh, he comes to your meetings. All right. So you know Michael Reichert. I work closely with him. Also Peter Kurloff and Sharon Ravitch and many others. And the center, the Rockport bullying study, and all of my work, as I just mentioned, uses an approach in social psychology. It has a long history, starting from the founder of social psychology, Kurt Lewin, called participatory action research, or PAR, or PAR. And so, as I mentioned, some of you might be familiar, some of you might not, so I just wanted to take a couple of minutes and explain the foundations of participatory action research. PAR is both a design and a method. A lot of people confuse it as a method, but if you confuse it as a method, I think you're missing a big part of this. It's both a design and a method, but most importantly, it's an epistemological and ethical stance on where knowledge lies, whom and with whom, how and with whom it should be produced, and how it should be used. PAR researchers believe that expertise is not solely concentrated in the university, but instead widely distributed, particularly among those most affected by or engaged with the topic of inquiry. Within PAR is believed that the quality of research is maximized through democratic inclusiveness, with individuals that have a diverse set of knowledges, skills, experiences, and values. So from a purely methodological standpoint, PAR is about validity and strength in what you produce. By producing research grounded in pressing issues with rather than on stakeholders, the purpose of PAR is to produce quality research that can be useful to countering the larger forces of inequality and injustice. Obviously, PAR is linked to critical theories like feminist standpoint and critical race and queer theories, and therefore is research that tends to be explicitly in alliance with those who are marginalized, which makes what I'm about to discuss kind of unusual. And I was mentioning before, and has some tensions. Most of the participatory scholarship is produced with and for and by those who tend to be disadvantaged. But there has been a small wave of scholarship that has recently emerged using PAR to directly study privilege with those who hold a great deal of systemic privilege. So this Rockport study is one of them. So I hope that as I go through this, that it becomes that beyond contributing to hopefully the men and masculinities literature, the gender literature, and maybe the social psychology literature, I hope it becomes clear that this work is intended to do what Deutsch, who was a student of Kurt Lewin, calls awakening a sense of injustice, or awakens or provokes what Freire calls critical consciousness. That it places the gaze back onto institutions, structures, and cultures that help to create context by which oppression occurs, and that help to create the context to which those who are privileged often see themselves as not directly involved, as detached or innocent from perpetuating disadvantage. And so that was partly the goal of this research. So now let me talk about the social psychology of privilege and this study. With the exception of a small group of scholars in the field of psychology, few in the U.S., many not in the U.S., structural privilege has not been examined very closely, at least in psychology. I know other fields have done better. And of course, men and masculinity, just studying men, tends to be around this. But the intersection of whiteness, males, heterosexual, and then particularly in this case, wealth, extreme wealth, is still really understudied. Donaldson in 1993, so many years ago now, said we should examine what he called ruling class masculinity. He wrote, "Even though the concept of hegemony is rooted in concern with class domination, systematic knowledge of ruling class masculinity is slight as yet, but is certainly intriguing." And though last couple of years, and with what Michael just showed me, that blog, and there's been a number of good ethnographies and good books that came out in the last couple of years in the gender studies literature and the educational literature, I still think there's a lot more to do around studying what this ruling class masculinity might be. Okay, so in this study I asked, in what ways are social class and masculinity enacted by boys through bullying, violence within an elite private school? And theoretically, I'll argue that at Rockport, bullying is frequent, emotionally ambiguous, justified, normative, and helps to reproduce hegemonic values. 2, bullying among the boys is not only an interpersonal part of the school culture. 3, bullying is part of the informal curriculum to educate for privilege. And 4, partnering with this local community in research helped to awaken a sense of injustice. Domhoff, who wrote, many of you may have read this, Who Rules America, argued that families can rise and fall in the class structure, but the institutions of the upper class persist. Elite private schooling, like Rockport, is one of those institutions. Rockport is an elite, single-sexed, private day school located in the suburban Pennsylvania Main Line. For those of you who know the Main Line, this is fairly well known since the beginning of the United States as being extremely blue blood, old American wealth. And this school that I worked in has a particular reputation even amongst the many private schools there. So I call this a site of hyperprivilege because it's serving mostly and geared mostly towards white, economically advantaged heterosexual males. Places like Rockport are places where boys have traditionally been trained to become the power elite. Imagine this, I think you can probably guess, but just to remind you, all 6 presidents or presidential candidates in the last 4 American campaigns were educated in elite private schools, including Obama. And actually, I read something recently, you could go back further, and there's very few presidents, and you can look at CEOs, and it's the same thing. Even to this day, these types of schools, boarding or day schools, tend to reproduce the power elite in the United States. And masculinity, and educating for certain types of hegemonic masculinity, have held a central position in upper class education for boys in both England and the US, and has been historically documented. So the shaping of particular types of ruling masculinities in schools has long been used in preparation for power and privilege. So I mentioned this is a participatory action research project, and so we did this work from start to finish. Me and 2 research teams, 4 seniors, all boys obviously, and then a faculty team. And the faculty team, as I'll mention, is made up of 3 female faculty and 1 male faculty. So the methods were created in collaboration with students and faculty researchers. We constructed the methods, had a lot of conversations, we conducted the interviews and surveys, we analyzed the data together, both quantitative and qualitative, and then we figured out how to present it back to the community from which it came. But as part of the tenets of participatory action research, the action part in the middle, we didn't just collect the information, we felt like we had an obligation to put it in action somewhere in the school, and we tried. I also want to make note that it wasn't at first the goal to have 2 teams. It was supposed to be a group of 8 faculty and students, and that fact that I found that to be really hard. The teachers found it hard to not be teachers when it came to students. And so we needed, in terms of power relationships, we needed to create a space where the students could really talk about their experiences without worrying about getting a bad letter of recommendation, or without worrying, and then the teachers could think about some of the important things that they do or think about students or faculty or administration, without having to worry they're breaking confidentiality with students. So we had to work in two groups and then figure out a way to link them up. And I think research and collecting data was a way of doing that. Okay, so the first thing that we did with the young men is to create a short, what I call survey interview. They didn't think that a survey proper would work because they felt like it looked like another test, so they created an interview process, but it had some quantitative and some open-ended questions to that. We started out by just having a lot of conversations. What is your experience like in school? What's your experience in terms of relationships and bullying and all, what does it mean to be a Rockport student? And we did a lot of reading. Actually, we did a lot of Men and Masculinities reading, and I remember reading Michael's work amongst others. And so it wasn't just what you feel, it was what you feel and what's been out there already in the world and so forth. The survey...
When you say we, you mean the teams,
yeah.
not the 96?
No, the team, as we're developing our research, was not only about this is my experience. We connected it up with other work that was going on. The survey that ultimately got developed over many drafts included 4 things. 1, bullying as a continuum, and I'll explain that in a moment. 2, an awareness of the types of bullying, an awareness that bullying may change by context, the frequency may change by context. An emphasis on positionality, that is just not about being the victim. You can also be a perpetrator, and you can be an observer, and you can be all of those in one day or in an hour. And understanding that bullying may potentially be a part of a culture or an ideology, or even facilitated by faculty. And then it was 4 students, and each of them went out and did 25 interviews in locker rooms, in classrooms, in cafeterias. And ultimately we got 96 9th through 12th graders, and that is actually, it's a very small school, so that was a large sample. Then after that, the faculty did their research. So the faculty was entirely directed by the students, both their conceptual understanding of bullying and the data that emerged. So 3 female faculty, 1 male faculty, and then they developed an interview protocol that, off of what the boys did, which asked experiences with bullying personally, observations of bullying at Rockport, their interpretations of bullying, what, if anything, should be done about bullying in the school, and then we asked the faculty interviewees and administrator interviewees to respond to the data collected by the boys, which was often very provocative, as a way to, I think that was a feedback loop. So there were 10 open-ended interviews, 8 teachers, 2 administrators. I actually did the interviews with the administrators, again for power reasons. So here's what we found. The first, the white noise of bullying. The student and faculty researchers used the data to discuss what they eventually, someone sort of called it out in one of our meetings one day, eventually came to understand or label as the white noise of bullying. And they labeled it that because of how widespread and taken for granted it was at Rockport. It's important to note that while I interpreted this broad range, these broad versions of bullying that I'll describe in a moment, as school violence, they didn't. The students didn't interpret it that way, and the faculty researchers didn't share my view and how I framed that. And that's a really important part of participatory research that comes up a lot. My interpretation of their experience as being bullying and violence, they didn't share. I think that's part of privilege and normalization of violence. They didn't see it that way. And in participatory work, it's okay to have that distinction, but I want to be honest about it. We found all of these were done by the young people in their presentation, these slides. We found evidence that when you recognize the multiplicity of bullying or violence, it's much more common than traditional representations of the boy bullying for lunch money or fights in the playground. And so this is just a 6-point Likert scale, and we In our conceptualization of bullying, the students understood it as ridiculing or teasing, bullying or intimidation, fighting or physical violence, and hazing and initiations. And you can see that the most common, by far, nearly everyone said that teasing and ridiculing was very common. And then it sort of went from there: bullying and intimidation, violence, and then hazing. But it's interesting that when you understand the continuum, and the boys understood it as a continuation of bullying, the frequency becomes much increased than just physical fighting. We also found evidence that bullying or violence was contextual. It's in 4 quads: ridiculing and teasing, bullying and intimidation. And we asked students in the survey, where is it most likely to happen? And I don't think it's surprising, somewhere. But hazing and initiations obviously were most likely to happen in sports, sports geography contexts on the field or in locker rooms. Physical violence, the same thing. But what I found interesting, and what came up in the data quite a bit, is how often ridiculing and teasing happened in classroom, or bullying happened in classrooms, or in cafeteria, and places that were both supervised and unsupervised. We also found evidence for the different positionality of bullying. Just want to make sure I'm on the, see what slide I am here. Yeah. We found evidence that bullying and violence was much more relational and fluid than some of the popular literature at the time. One book that was really sort of one book that the school that I was working in really enjoyed at the time was Sachs's Why Gender Matters. And this work sort of countered that work. If you're familiar with that book, it's now a number of years, I think 2005. But I was surprised that I knew that people were going to be, young people were going to be able to talk about being bullied as a victim. And I kind of had an idea that they would be able to talk about being an observer of bullying. I was surprised that how many, nearly everyone, was able to describe ways in which they were the perpetrator of bullying. And so let me explain. So here's an example of victim. When I was initiated for crew team, we all went to a dark room with an alarm clock going off, and the juniors and the seniors all stood in there and yelled at us not to move. When we were called into another room, we had to get our heads shaved. And as perpetrator, while racing down the ski slopes, my sister beat one of my friends, and so I teased the other boy for losing to a girl. I guess he was a little embarrassed, but I think it was just banter between 2 friends. And then as observer, there's this one kid in the senior class that everyone picks on. You take it for granted that kids are just going to give him a hard time. It's almost as if we need to feel good about ourselves by teasing him. You want to say something, but most of the time all you can do is just sit there and watch it happen. You don't want to let it happen, but you don't want to hurt your reputation.
Right.
Yeah.
Can I just point out one thing in the Observer? There's one sentence that's first person plural, and all of the rest is second person. The sentence where he says, it's almost as if we need to feel good about ourselves, and then the rest is back to you. And it's very interesting that he can own that one sentence, but the rest he sort of puts it out there.
I've never thought about that before, and that's really interesting. He owned up to there, and then it starts...
and then puts it. Then
that's good
goes back to
qualitative
second
research.
person.
I never thought about that. I'm going to have to rewrite my article. What was interesting, and it actually goes along this line, is that in these private schools, you're not let in for 4 years, you're let in 1 year at a time. Same with teachers, they don't have a contract. It's 1 year at a time. And so you can get expelled, almost zero tolerance, except if you have a whole lot of money. Your name is on a gym, but that's... you get expelled for fighting. Fighting and certain forms of hazing, though hazing is highly ritualized, so they made big distinctions between ritualized institutional hazing and like the bad type of hazing, but I didn't see a distinction. But so I didn't hear about the traditional bullying or the fighting, even though I suspect some of it was there, because that would get you in trouble, or you would make yourself vulnerable. But the teasing and some of the other hazing practices that were institutionalized, very common to hear about. We also were interested in emotion. So when we asked students to talk about the different positionalities of victim, perpetrator, observer of bullying, then we also asked, we gave a list of emotions that we came up with, and we asked an open-ended question about emotions. What emotions came up for you in the story you just told? So rather than blanket, the story you just told, tell us about the emotions. And this is listed. We have lines going there to just be the 50% mark so you could get a sense. A couple of points that I want to bring up. I find it interesting that for victim and observer, the three top emotions are the same. Annoyed, uncomfortable, and angry. Annoyed, uncomfortable, and angry. There's two thoughts about that I have. One is maybe that helps us understand about a bullying intervention. The fact that to observe, the same emotions come up as to be a victim. So, you know, in terms of empathy, I can imagine holding a good conversation about observing and how that's related to victim. But the other is that observing is a type of violence too. That you know, there is the victim, but there are three parties to the positionality when it comes to this type of school violence, and it seems like some of the emotions are the same and needs to be considered about what it means to witness. The other thing is confused. I put it in green. Confused came up more than half of the time, or yep, at each moment, including and in particular the perpetrator. Another, I felt like it brought up a sense of ambiguity and maybe moral ambiguity, and the fact that it came up at each time, just, you know, when we think obviously about the stereotypical masculinity, the confused, the vulnerability isn't the thing, isn't the projection. And then the red has to do with emotions of power and hierarchy and, you know, energy and happiness, you know, and they're the most important as the perpetrator, and they're on the bottom of observer and victim. And, you know, we heard this over and over again in interviews. It pays to be the first to attack. It pays to not be on your heels. The perpetrator gets some rewards within a social relationship in that you're not, the gaze isn't on you. And so there's something about that, particularly as it's relating to the verbal battling, the verbal bullying, that is so much a part of what they're talking about. And then finally, unmanly. Unmanly, at 43%, was the highest for victim. Actually, it's one of the things that has come up time and time again with the experience of stop and frisk among young black and brown men, feeling emasculated. And so I just found that interesting and wanted to point it out.
I just want to ask a clarifying question. Yeah. These were words that they gave, or did you give them a list of words?
What we did was, as a group, one of our discussions was to come up, like it was a free flow discussion. What are the types of emotions, positive and negative, that can come up in these positions? And then we did first like focus groups and piloting to get more words, and then those became on the survey what we asked people to check off. And they could also, there was an other, and they could also add their own. But the idea was we did some piloting and upfront thinking of so that we'd have the same words for people to respond to.
And these were words that you asked them to give for how they felt at the time that they were telling the story?
No, how they felt about the story. So we wanted them to be very specific, because the emotions can be generalized if you're sort of averaging. Yeah. We asked them stories about bullying from the different positions, and then asked them to reflect upon the emotions they experienced in that moment. And in terms of validity, one might question, and I think it's valid, can you remember how you felt in that moment if it was a long time ago? But a lot of the stories that they were talking about were within weeks or months, and so I think there was some level of consciousness to how they felt.
Can I ask a quick
related
question? In terms of the three categories you had, are those that they come from the students themselves, that they talk about, and what is that the word they use, victim, perpetrator, and observer, or were there other words used, or are those words you've imposed on this?
Everything that all the words, even the idea of bullying / intimidate, all those things came out of the fact that the young men that I worked with found very hard to operationalize what we were doing. And so this was our solution. We knew that words have power and matter, so when we used, slashes, and in this case, no, I wouldn't have used the word perpetrator. But this is the word, I kept going back and entering other ideas of that, but this is the word that they were particularly felt captured what they were doing. But no, I mean, I think that's a good point. There are other words that I think might be better. Yeah?
I just have a question about, maybe it relates a little to the same about, like, maybe the school narrative of bullying. I don't know how it is here, but in Denmark, there's been this huge amount of campaigns trying to reorganize the school narrative of bullying, saying that being an observer is complicity and you're as bad as the perpetrator. So I think today Danish children wouldn't talk about, they wouldn't distinguish, they would be fed in with this narrative about how complicity is the same as being a perpetrator.
It's interesting. I mean, this was 2005, 2006, and then it lasted a long time, but this study, and I do think things that I have changed, but also in this particular school, it's a great school from an educational standpoint, but it's also a very conservative school in a George Bush era, where they would wear the flag on, they had a Young Republicans Club. So it's just like it's a little bit like going back in time. Yeah.
Just on the back of what Anna Sophie was saying, and I'm looking at the top 3 for victim and observer there, and it makes me wonder if they somehow see themselves similarly.
I wonder.
Maybe because the discourse around bullying might be different in that particular school, but more broadly it is different over here than it is in Europe, for instance. And if there's a sense of powerlessness in the observer that makes them sort of feel almost like a victim by proxy.
That's interesting, yeah. Maybe. Maybe. There's some other quotes coming up, and it would be interesting to connect that.
Maybe you're going to talk about this, but I'm just struck that everybody has essentially the same level of trust. The perpetrator, the observer, and the victim. This whole situation doesn't do a lot for trust.
Trust came up as a big theme. Always having to be on guard. I'm actually have some quotes on that. It became a thing. All right, next. Everyone knows that it's sort of a rich white kid school. Everyone has a sense of humor about it. Disciplining and reproducing privilege. At first pass, we wondered if these were just random acts of bullying or violence. When we made a list of all the actual things or reasons for being bullied, it seemed like there was no way to walk through the halls of Rockport without being unscathed. One student said, it's like walking a tightrope. So these were some in the list. Reasons for being bullied. Personality, the way a boy walks, doing too much work, doing too little work, not being smart, being too smart, not being athletic, selfishness, accidentally breaking something, eating a potato chip funny, being a freshman, being weaker, odd clothing color combination, telling an unfunny joke. One of the students said, it can be for anything that is different. You're always vulnerable, and so you always need to be on guard. And so, let me read the full quote. Well, I also noticed a little bit like people who are different, just like anything they do different. It could be anything. I think part of that is like, no matter who you are vulnerable because it could be anyone who takes a shot at you. Like, I'm a big guy and I'm like on the basketball team, and like a freshman could anytime come up and say something, and like everyone else on the team will laugh at it. So it's like anyone can come at you from any side pretty much. What makes this quote really interesting to me, he was one of the co-researchers, is that he's probably the most prominent student in school. He had the highest GPA in class. He was the captain of the crew in the basketball team. He was really tall and good looking. And he had just been accepted into Harvard with a full scholarship. So he had everything, and yet still felt vulnerable and couldn't live up to that dominant sense of masculinity. Indeed, other researchers who have spent time in elite schools have found an unusual amount of masculine-oriented bullying. Cookson and Purcell, in their famous book Preparing for Power, wrote that they found few tender mercies among boys. On second and third pass, however, we determined that much of the bullying and violence was not random at all. Instead, we found that much of the bullying and violence, particularly the verbal bullying, helped to discipline in the Foucaultian sense, and reproduce a set of dominant, privileged, hegemonic values. Let me read some of these quotes to you. One of the most common ways we saw, well, let me talk about heteronormative masculinity. On top of the demands that the teachers put on us, the students subconsciously put pressures on other students. Pressures that include making sure your tie is not considered a gay tie because of the coloring. On a dress down day, there is the added pressure of wearing a certain pair of jeans because they won't be considered tough enough. Or the saying on your sweatshirt is as gay as the pink tie you wore 2 days ago. So there was a lot of heteronormative values going on in the teasing, in particular the bullying. There was a lot of implicit socioeconomic status bullying going on. For example, take chemistry class. There's such a low level of white noise of bullying when he's a little too late for class. We're talking about one boy in particular. They say, is your train late? Pointing out that he has to take a train while they get driven from their rich neighborhoods, but he came from a poor neighborhood. There are all these ways that you never quite cut it. The way you dress, where you live, the way you live, all these ways you're not quite good enough. And then around race ethnicity, which was really common, as a joke, really. Remarks about race hurt me. This is a young African-American student. Remarks about race hurt me and made me feel less a part of the group. Even though they are said in a playful setting, I went through middle school with the nickname Midnight, and that was quite hurtful. One of the most common ways we saw, one of the most common themes that came up in our data was the normalcy and the frequency of homophobic teasing and ridiculing, which is obviously closely connected to the reproduction of heteronormative masculinity. Homophobia and homophobic comments were recognized as common, but not recognized by many as hurtful or problematic. Take the first two. You're gay, that's something I hear all the time. It's a word we use so much. The second one, gay in our school doesn't mean homosexual, it means stupid. It doesn't mean homosexual. Like, if I call someone, oh, you're gay, it doesn't mean I think he's homosexual, it means that he's stupid or did something stupid. I'm sure you hear, but I hear all the time at John Jay College, or no homo, and then, things like that. One student who identified as gay reacted to homophobia and the meaning of homophobic comments. The third one down. I am gay. I was the first kid ever to come out at Rockport in the 100-year history. 100-plus year history. So that was a big deal. Initially there was just grumblings and outrage and confusion. I just think because it's like against the norm, and I think it's kind of looked down upon if you're gay. So if you want to get a point across, you're not going to be like, stop being straight, because it really wouldn't do any good. What does that mean? But everyone knows what you mean if you call someone gay. Several weeks later, after Rockport, the headmaster and the board declined his request to start a gay-straight alliance in the school. Among other things that were going on in his life, he attempted suicide. What's interesting is that his starting the gay-straight alliance, my godson and closest friend live in this area, and it got out to all the alumni. The school, and there was discussion, phone conversations amongst alumni that the school's getting soft. So it's not, in these schools, it's not just in the school, because the alumni is connected and these schools tend to keep, there's a lot of money and other things coming in. There's a larger community involved. And then the final one, a year later I spoke to the administrator that he went to get the Gay-Straight Alliance. And this is what he said. Well, here's what I think, and this is okay, I've accepted this. Rockport is a conservative institution. It is a more open-minded conservative institution than it was 10 years ago when I started, but it's a conservative institution, it's always going to be a conservative institution. I should say that he was deeply upset that he didn't push harder for the Gay-Straight Alliance. He felt that he really let down that student. But it does illustrate how strong the hegemonic tide is to resist. He wanted to do something. If you talk to the headmaster, he wanted to do something. But everyone was looking for everyone else to move, and in the end, nothing happened, and I think it really hurt. So remarks like this, for example, were homophobic, anti-feminine, or racist, help to impose the boundaries of who's in and who's out, what is acceptable and what is unacceptable, who is normal and who is marginalized. They help to police and reproduce a local culture embedded in hegemonic values, what Harvey has called civilized oppression. Next, decking him is a fancy way of saying, you're my best friend, I love you. Verbal bullying and violence like teasing and ridiculing was so common within the institution that it was often normalized or made to seem okay or even worthwhile. I want to read you a quote from an administrator that I interviewed. This is what he said. "There is a real premium on appropriately sarcastic teasing, finding a weakness and playing on it without exploiting. That's a skill I think kids relish. I would put that in the category of emotional intelligence. The kids who really struggle here are those who are not verbal. Kids who come new in 9th grade or 7th grade from the middle class environments can't believe some of the things that are said. Which kids who have been here all their lives just realize he's just joking." So civilized oppression is entrenched at Rockport, I believe, because it is so wrapped up in the ambiguous emotions of masculine performances. At the same time there is extreme competition and hierarchy, there's friendship. This school is riddled with insults and fierce competition, yet in my mind, I think that most of it is good. The reasons for this are that male interaction is founded upon a system of hierarchy, a hierarchical system of respect and popularity built from these interactions. Beneficial teasing has aided in development of friendships. It may sound funny, but I am honored when others pick on me. At the same time, there is fear through hazing, there is unity and belonging, the second one. My freshman year, I was forced to sit in a dark room by several of the seniors. I was tied up and had to remain silent. I didn't know what was going to happen, but I trusted the upperclassmen, and so didn't really fear for my safety. By the end of the season, I was glad that I had this experience. I felt that the incident had really accomplished something and had built strong unity, unity that I don't believe would have existed without hazing. Most importantly, me and my friends feel like we belong. At the same time, there's teasing and humor. There is this potential for pain and the distribution of power, last one. I experience teasing on a day-to-day basis, but most of it is the fun kind. Although there are times when it bothers me, sometimes someone will make a joke that is more personal, but I just keep on laughing. It's good to laugh things off. If someone comes across as being funny, other people will think better of them. It is really a great way for someone to advance himself. This ambiguous emotional relationship between men and violence has a long history. For example, Shakespeare's Henry V, "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers, for he today that sheds blood with me shall be my brother." And I think you can probably imagine, in literature and in TV shows and in many other contexts, this idea of bonding through violence, camaraderie through pain, and masculinity is often there. Civilized oppression may often come at the unintended consequences of masculine versions of intimacy, of friendship, bonding, and care. In the cases of these boys, the unintended consequences help to reproduce values that secure their own privilege. From the headmaster on down, it's systemic, violence and school culture. C. Wright Mills in 1956 wrote of the power elite, "The vitals of prep school are not located in the curriculum. They are located in dozens of other places, some of them odd places indeed, in the relation between boys and faculty, in who the boys are and where they come from, in a Gothic chapel or a shiny new gymnasium." And this was certainly true for Rockport. It's a beautiful campus. It rivals many college campuses. They have an enormous amount of resources. And it's in a really fancy address, among other things. Bullying and violence is understood as an issue belonging to students and or between the social relationships of students. And it clearly was an important daily part of the students' interactions, an essential part of their social interactions with peers. But it was also embedded in at least 3 other institutional practices. Rockport's symbolic use of space, a competitive culture focused on elite college admissions, and the faculty's interactions with the boys. I believe bullying and violence at Rockport is not so much a break in the culture, but an expression of it. In fact, bullying or violence was an institutional problem in which the entire community was implicated. At some point in our discussions over the year, the faculty and researchers realized or concluded that from the headmaster on down, it's systemic. Rockport's symbolic use of space and the environment created by certain spaces helped to reproduce dominant institutional values and facilitate bullying and violence. So let me read these first 2 here. Straight in front of you are 2 huge rooms dedicated to the college office. Hello? I mean, what is important to Rockport? Getting your kid into college. But service learning is buried in the basement. These are strong implicit messages, which I think oftentimes get overlooked or just taken for granted. That was, an administrator told me that. A white student told me, or explained, the crew locker room is big and it's dark and kids are getting change. It's far from campus and basically unsupervised. So you can do so much stuff, like you are so exposed. Like there are always people pushing each other and it's such a competitive sport anyway. So I mean, it's like breeding ground. If you are soft, you just won't, yeah, you'll just be eaten alive. Many reported that parents' expectations of college, particularly elite college, help contribute to this competitive hierarchical environment. For parents, it's an act of class consciousness. I mean, I think Rockport is really competitive. There's too much competition. The sports I'm involved in, the competition is, everyone is backstabbing. Like friendships between, in the fall, it's just so competitive between a few of my like really close friends, and it just like ruined it for us a little bit. Next one. I had a crazy mom a couple of years ago say, if he doesn't get into a place like Princeton, then he's going to meet the wrong woman. It will totally blow his future because he won't have the right network. All parents care about is college. It's the only thing they ever talk about. It's ridiculous. They are always about college. Where are you going to college? I seriously think parents are worse than kids. Parents know everything about every kid and what they do on weekends and what kinds of grades they get. And I don't know, it just rubs off on kids. And then finally, it is this high competition that creates anxiety, that creates the pressure, and the pressure valve is the teasing. This is how they get through it all. All these messages that the kids are getting are that grades are the most important thing, the college thing. And that was from a white female guidance counselor. This theme kept coming up, that the amount of teasing, this masculine teasing, was really a result of the amount of competition and hierarchy of getting in a really good elite school. It wasn't just, what's really important here is that faculty were also involved in the reproduction of bullying. For example, these are quotes by or discussions by faculty members. They really discussed, this came up over and over again, the need to be verbally combative or quick to establish power in the classroom, that this was different than girls' schools, for example, that some had taught at. So there was a lot of jokes around, from teachers and students around class. Like a teacher told me once that I'm going to be the one who bags her groceries one day. There was a lot of jokes around getting into community college, which was a common joke by teachers. There are also faculty practices, like if I had a son, I wouldn't send him here. It's too competitive. Maybe I shouldn't be posting grades, a lot of posting grades. They all know because everyone stands there and says, oh, you did this and this, to see where you stand among the men. I also keep track of witty-like put-downs during class in a scoreboard-like way on the blackboard. Actually, 4 teachers did this. They had a ranking, and when kids came up with a witty comment or something sarcastic, or the teacher did, they would play a game of putting it on the board, which I'd never seen before.
What a contradiction. I wouldn't send him here, and then look what I do.
Right.
Yeah, the distinction. And then they talk about the verbal sparring. Verbal sparring is currency around here. I think it is one of the ways you are well regarded by students. If they see you are able to be verbally really quick and verbally not necessarily mean, but clever. If a kid does something, you hit right back. You are clever, you're nasty, it's on edge, it's a shade away from being hurtful. What came up over and over again is that the young people were justifying their bullying as necessary, and the faculty were justifying this as necessary within this climate, which I thought was really interesting. And then the juxtaposition of masculinity or masculine expectations from faculty. I find myself saying things to these boys that I would never ever have considered saying to any of the girls that I've ever taught. They would have been in tears. Their parents would have been into the school and saying, this is a horrible teacher. Right? And so they were very clear about the juxtaposition about what they could say to young men and what they could say to young women. And finally, and this was important to me in my own work as well, which was that female faculty had to confront on a regular basis this masculine-oriented culture by which it hadn't been too long, over a decade I believe, or a little bit more, where women faculty were even existed within the school. So female faculty discussing and confronting sexism. Yeah, the women here, give me a break. There is just stuff we put up with, you know, comments all the time, jokes. It's always underlying. I received a birthday card from an administrator addressed to my husband, Mrs. James Smith. Sexist jokes. This joke, they said, was one of the students, I guess, said at an event. Want to hear a joke? The feminist movement. Some men are totally insensitive to what they say about females in the presence of female teachers. For example, that really insensitive joke that the administrator emailed to everyone. And then there is tacit approval. There is this tacit approval on things that are said in assemblies that kids are allowed to say, remarks that the kids, that literally male faculty administrators will laugh at instead of stopping it or saying that it's inappropriate to say. And if you went to any of these men individually, they wouldn't think they were doing anything wrong. And through all this, the faculty researchers, it forced us to confront whose responsibility is it for change within the institution, or what's the expectation, and whose should it be? Where should the responsibility lie? And so the last one. When female faculty do come forward and say, listen, this is inappropriate, those female faculty are labeled as feminist crazies or bitch feminists. Or when we go to do an administrator, they say, well, why don't you women do an assembly? Yeah, like we're going to be out there like the bitch feminists when it should actually be from the men who do this. Why is it our job? It leaves everyone else off the hook and causes us to be those tokens to speak out for women. So it's from every angle within the institution, we're hearing both bullying and experiencing this culture. We are training these people socially in a way that they don't even realize what they are developing outlooks on life. Now I want to get to how I believe some of what I was seeing is part of the education for a type of privilege, a class privilege that the young people and their parents have sent them there to get. C. Wright Mills, again in 1956, wrote, "The private school is the most important agency for transmitting the traditions of the upper social classes and regulating the emissions of the new wealth and talent. Our evidence suggested that the white noise of bullying was not just a product of competitive, hegemonic masculine culture. Instead, it was a central ingredient in Rockport's training of its students for the power elite, an education for and legitimating of their privileged station in life." Others have supported this point. Again, Cookson and Purcell argued, "What one boy described as the dog-eat-dog elements in the boy culture provide ample opportunities to learn that survival and success do not go to the weak, but to the strong. A philosophy of life well suited to managing power relations in financial and in the business world." New in 2001 also suggested, "The social construction of such constricted masculine cells does indeed produce subjects who can function well in a capitalistic patriarchal organization and who can take their places as agents of women's oppression." We heard data from students, teachers, and administrators reflecting these sentiments. Starting from the top, anticipating a future with violence, one young boy said, "It's going to be like this in the outside world. If you work for a big company or a law firm, you're going to have to take all the crap from the guys who have been there for a while. It's going to be like that. It's not going to be like, this guy's new, okay, all right, we've got to show him the ropes. Like, okay, be nice to him. You're just going to be thrown in there. You're going to have to know how to make your way around." A wrestling coach and teacher, a white male wrestling coach and teacher said, "In male societies, there's a certain pecking order. There's a dominance that needs to be established. And there are kids at the bottom of that pack who are going to be the ones who are pushed away from the food. This is the way it is. I think we should try to get that person to a point in his life where he has enough self-esteem to stand up to what he believes in and defend himself physically, defend himself morally. Where are these programs?" Training for violence. It is what it is. This was an administrator. It is what it is. You're taking kids from incredibly competitive, high-driven families and you're putting them together. To say you're going to stop kids from snapping at, competing with, or bullying and teasing and ridiculing each other is never going to happen. I mean, you know a lot of these kids are from families from the blue blood and capitalism, sinking or swimming. It's about competition. It's about crushing the other guy. The implicit curriculum is that we are training you to become a member of the elite, which means recognizing competition, recognizing when you've got to get these advantages, and then training for elite. The implicit curriculum here, again, an administrator who told me the implicit curriculum here is an elite. For example, we don't drag kids onto the carpet for not absolutely following the rules all the time. I mean, it's not because we're lax, it's because I think it's almost an expectation. You're just kind of implying, hey, you're going to be in a station in life. Well, sure, you're supposed to show up on time. But if you don't, people are going to wait for you, or people are going to make exceptions for you. So I'll conclude with this, in terms of participatory research. This study has, for the first time, made me think about what I'm saying in class, awakening a sense of injustice. Awakening a sense of injustice operates differently and is directed towards different audiences depending on the project. With the Rockport Bullying Project, awakening a sense of injustice is directed institutionally inward. It is about using research to awaken a sense of connection to injustice in this elite institution. That bullying, that violence is systemic and with consequences that spill beyond the Rockport walls. As a result of our research, the student and faculty researchers prepared presentations to convey the research data to members of their community. And these are 3 graphics that they gave at their presentation showing the different types of bullying, which was illuminating for a lot of folks to recognize that ridiculing and teasing is also a type of bullying and on a continuum. Actually, what really helped, Michael, was you had written an article about people who white males were most likely to bring guns and have the massive killings in schools. Right. You remember that? I forget when it was. We read that article, and this continuum came up for them because it wasn't clear that someone who brings a gun in school, that was entirely disconnected from the other culture and the other bullying. Mm. And so that led us to thinking about a continuum. And that was illuminating for the group. These are maps, heat maps that the students put together about where different types of bullying are most likely on the campus. That was good for the other students. The teachers gave a presentation. I was particularly proud of this, where they pointed to misogynistic discussion, socioeconomic, class bullying, race, sexuality, physical weakness, academic competition, that this became a dialogue that had been hidden or normalized before that. As a result of our research, the student and faculty researchers prepared presentations to convey the research data to members of their community. In this process, they began to imagine alternatives, ways that they could build awareness and make changes within their community. And so these are quotes I pulled out from the 2 presentations where they begin imagining what to do. The students' presentation was called the Rockport Peer Interaction Study, Eat or Be Eaten. And some of the initiatives that they suggested were developing awareness and emotional intelligence in students, organize town hall meetings around this issue, and then teachers to be more aware when teasing and ridiculing goes too far. And then on the bottom here, this was the faculty presentation, and it was titled The White Noise of Teasing at Rockport. And they suggested to intervene through various initiatives within our community, including peer leadership counseling, town meetings, and upper school advisory program. We will work to raise issues publicly in order to make students and faculty aware of the debate, and we will develop methods of sensitizing the Rockport community regarding this issue. Over the course of a year, the student and faculty researchers at Rockport collected compelling data of local consequence. In doing so, they built institutional momentum that became a school-wide multi-year initiative. In some ways, it's still going on around bullying. They built institutional awareness. They created spaces to voice concern with data. They expanded a participation in institutional inquiry, helped to legitimize discussions of sensitive topics, but they also became aware of some of their own, sort of a meta-analysis of their own practices, their own privilege, masculine or class privilege. And so this is from the white male counselor who said, I really think the fact of me just doing this study has made me so much more aware of, what can I say, how can I say it? I mean, it doesn't sound like a revelation at all, but I guess to me it initially was. I guess someplace early on, you have to dispel the notion that bullying is just physical. It is so subtle and so intrinsic in our culture here that people say they don't recognize it as bullying. I didn't until we started having this conversation, but yeah, it is. And then a white student and co-researcher said, on a basic level, I think it is sort of that we at Rockport are set at an elevation of high moral standards. And I realized that these aren't like special people with high moral standards. They are everyday people, and they are doing what everybody else does, like in public school. This is a constant theme. The juxtaposition between private school students and public school students, and the juxtaposition of morality, that there was a certain morality within the school. And then students examining assumptions of race. This came as we were looking at our data through an interview that one of the students did with a young student of color. Actually, the thing that was real interesting about that, I don't know if it's bad to say or something, but I interviewed an African-American kid, and he didn't label himself as African-American, and I thought that was really weird. It's like such a small group of kids at Rockport who are African-American, and this led into almost an hour discussion on white privilege, on race in the school, and so the data brought up these discussions. I'll leave it at that, but just to say that, as I mentioned, PAR generally is not done in privileged environments. And I think if you do, there's a real responsibility that your audience, the person, the people, the groups that you're held accountable to, are those that privilege hurts. You know, the disadvantage or the disadvantages that hold up this type of systemic privilege. Because otherwise you end up in these sort of ethically problematic situations, which I can discuss at another time, you know, where if you're allowing the research to be grounded, what's really on the young people's mind might be, you know, doing better in school, so then you find yourself doing research on how to improve academic life for folks who are already highly privileged in academic life. There are ways in which it's not an easy mend, and so a real critical philosophy as you go in, I think is really important. I'll leave it at that, and then I can take, obviously, any questions. Thank you.
You're perfectly welcome to call on people yourself.
Yeah, any questions? Yeah.
A number of things. I really enjoyed your talk. I think one of the things I was noticing, and I've seen this in things that my students at Dowling are mostly white working class.
Yeah.
But I get from them the same sort of thing where there's a kind of both statement that we live in a dog-eat-dog world and it's terrible, and yet we have to just go along with it. And that's throughout the things that you've got up there.
Yeah.
Both the acceptance of it,
yeah.
But also an implicit criticism of it. And I wonder, maybe I'm just trying to be slightly hopeful, but I wonder if that implicit criticism could be kind of brought forth and made overt at the school in some way.
Yeah, I mean, I think the masculine norms, regardless of class, I don't think they're working for anyone, and I think people feel that conflict. And it seems like if you allow the space to deconstruct it, I am hopeful that there's something there. Yeah, and yeah, I know. So.
No, go ahead.
I was just thinking about, it's really interesting. I really admire the study and also the social, or the action research part of it. But I was thinking, did they actually recognize the gender aspect, or did they more see the race and the class thing? Because they were like, oh, it was the sexist thing with the female teachers, but like how?
That's really interesting. This might be, and here's an example where my bias and focus, since I'm up here, you know, and we're not as a group, might have played. I'm particularly interested in class as it intersects with gender and sexual orientation and other things. And so my focus across all the studies and work that we did over the years has been on exploring that. The only way I was even allowed in, I mean, the Center for the Study of Boys and Girls Lives, it's a consortium of these schools. And so each year we're doing work. But bullying was very easy as a topic to do in this school. There was a national story around it at the time, and bullying as related to gender, particularly of ways we can improve our education of boys, was the key in. And it was that key, and the knowing that once we went in through bullying, looking at and focusing first on just masculinity and gender, that we would get data that would allow us to explore the other power and other things, other types of privilege and class. So you're seeing maybe my bias, but really in the moment of that work, a lot of what was heard was around gender. Now, what didn't get heard, which ended up being some of our biggest finding around gendered performances, was that it wasn't a safe climate for students who wanted to be out, who were gay. That was a clear, you know, in terms of an action researcher, that was a clear place for intervention. And while we had all the freedom in the world to do work, and they gave us all the resources, at the point of doing an intervention around that, it caused a great deal of problems. So that's where I find that interesting. Oh, then now we got, oh, okay, we'll go that way. We'll start here and we'll go around.
Okay, I'm gonna end up talking about Anna Sophie's question, but I want to start with a hypothesis. This is so ubiquitous. This is so universal at so many different kinds of elite schools.
Yeah.
So there's a long discredited theoretical tradition in sociology called functionalism, which says if something exists universally, there must be some reason for it.
Right.
So in listening to you, I was trying to figure out, like, what's the reason for this? And I came up with two.
Okay.
One is that they have to negotiate a massive contradiction, which you have exposed. These kids are isolated, under enormous pressure, super competitive, and in a world of absolutely visible and transparent hierarchy. At the same time, they all have to pretend to be friends.
Right.
They all have to pretend to be bonding among equals, like teammates and brothers. As you know, every single fraternity in America, you know, quotes that one line of Henry V, and only that one line.
Yeah.
So that they have to navigate this contradiction between the super competitive, hierarchical, isolating world that they're facing of, like, what college am I going to go to? Am I going to get into a good school? And pretending to be, and this. So I think that this kind of is what Arlie Hochschild calls something that, like, lubricates their interactions, that enables them to navigate both the fraud of their bonding and the intense pressure of their competition. That's hypothesis one.
Let me just say that the school, the sister school to this one, someone wrote an article on, it was an all-girls school, on the culture, the tyranny of friendliness, which I also saw here, which is everyone has to be nice. Underneath, it's not.
And underneath, you know, there's only there's only 4 of us who are getting into Princeton from this school.
Right.
And you're getting there, and I'm not.
That's
so
right.
I would be surprised. I would bet that actually all the teasing and lubrication prevents me from sneaking into your room and ripping up your homework.
But the parents do. They know everyone's rank in the class, so that's interesting.
So this is one hypothesis. The other hypothesis is, I think that one of the ways that the elite, there was a great social psychology experiment. Some of you may have heard this. It was on NPR. This social psychologist at NYU, I'm sure you know him. He took people and he gave them a Monopoly game, and half of them. Do you know this study, Sally? Half of them got regular sort of scores and everything, but the other half were told at the beginning, this game is completely rigged. Every time you go around the board, you're going to get triple the money that everyone else gets. Whenever you land on properties, you get to buy it for less money. I mean, everything was completely rigged. At the end of the game, he interviewed the winners, who were, of course, the ones who benefited from the rigging. He interviewed the riggers, and they all described how well they had played, which enabled them to win. So
the meritocracy.
Right, so they believed it was a meritocracy, even though everyone was completely aware at the outset that it was utterly and completely rigged. So here's my second hypothesis. That learning to take this shit gives you the idea that when you were a member of the elite, you actually earned it.
I have quotes, I should put it in. I am certain of that. That seems to be the thing. You feel like you've earned it. You've gone through this shit. It's like hazing a fraternity.
That's right. You've paid your dues now, and so now what you get when you join the elite that was already there for you, for God's sake, now you feel like you actually deserve it.
I think that's right.
So those are my two sort of Parsonian functionalist hypotheses about the ubiquity of this. But I want to address Anna Sophie's thing, because I think there's an opportunity, perhaps in terms of, I was fascinated by the PAR model.
Yeah.
I think there's an opportunity to do an intervention that you didn't talk about. And I want to just describe an event that I had. My worst experience consulting with a school. It's a private school here in New York City, all boys, perhaps the most elite school in the nation. We'll call it Ivy. And it's a high-rise, and so there are elevators in the building, and the top, the seniors, and this is a school with a complete perfect pyramid in terms of faculty. The K-12, the kindergarten, first grade teachers are all young women aged 23 right out of college, and of course the top level, senior physics teachers are all men. This is a school that boasts that it gets more students, higher percentage of students, into Harvard, Princeton, and Yale than any other school in the country, and that's the only schools they measure. Right, okay. So, the women would get in these elevators with seniors who were basically 4 years or 3 years younger than them and feel intimidated and harassed. The school called me in to do some work with the faculty to talk about the campus climate. So I did this with a colleague who was running the Gender Studies Center at the Ed School at Harvard. What we did was we separated the female and male faculty. We did a little workshop with them in which we asked them one question. How has your being a man or woman here at Ivy affected your experience? The women all talked about feeling intimidated, feeling afraid, and so all of this sort of stuff. And the men all talked about the boys. The male faculty didn't say a word about themselves, because, gender is invisible to men. But they all talked about the boys and how they're working through gender issues and adolescent male development, etc. So we come back together, the women describe their experiences, and the men look at me and say, we didn't answer your question, did we? I said, no, you didn't. and what happened was, there was a terrible, and this is, I think, the part that Anna Sophie is raising. There was a terrible moment when the female faculty realized that the male faculty identified more with the boys than with them as colleagues and professionals.
Oh, wow.
And that's what your female faculty were saying also. And I think that's what her question was. There's an opportunity to go back to this faculty and work with the male faculty and say, you are abandoning your colleagues. If I were, so the female teacher who said I wouldn't send my son here, I wouldn't let my sister teach there.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Right? And so I think there's an opportunity for the ongoing relationship of the center with the school, right? To talk about the ways in which the male teacher's collusion with the boys, identification with the boys, actually prevents them or inhibits them from being adequate colleagues to the women, to seeing that the women teachers are being bullied as well.
What's amazing is that Michael Reichert is a psychologist in the school, so
I know.
It is really interesting what he could do and what he has been doing, frankly.
I'm going to talk to him.
Talk to him.
Now that I've seen this, I'm going to see him in a few hours, so I will talk with him.
That's good. I think that'd be great. Thank you for all that. Go ahead.
Two things, okay. One is that my younger brother, my dad was in the Foreign Service, we moved around a lot, and a lot of the time we were overseas, and my younger brother was with us when we were in Karachi, and we went to a very small American school, had 100 kids in the high school, and he was enough younger that he was in junior high during the time we were there. My older brother and I went through there, we graduated, we went off to college and did well. My younger brother, by the time he got to around 9th grade, my parents were back in the States, but they thought they were going to Africa where there would not be a local school, and so they decided to send him to boarding school. So they sent him to Deerfield, which was a similar situation. And in fact, it was the last holdout to going co-ed of the sort of New England prep schools.
Oh, wow.
They had an old and extremely anti-female headmaster who held on to this as long as possible and would schedule all kinds of things like the newest James Bond film whenever they had any kind of interaction scheduled, like a dance or something. So essentially the boys were totally discouraged from interacting with women at all. And my brother described to me, he hated it, and he described to me this exact tightrope walking thing. I mean, it's like listening to him when I was listening to your data. And how you had to be so quick-witted, you had to be never let anybody see any weakness or they'd attack you, and he was very successful there, went on to college and stuff. But he told me that he felt it damaged his ability to relate to women, that he, had, if he hadn't had a sister, he wouldn't even know how to talk to a girl. And that these, the other guys there who had been in the school even longer were even worse.
Yeah.
And he thought it was because there were no women, no girls in the school, that this accelerated this kind of behavior. And he was doing that by comparing it to our small, very interactive co-ed high school in Karachi. I'm wondering what you think about whether or not, for instance, if you went to one of these prep schools that is co-ed, you would see the same phenomenon among the boys or across the whole school, or?
We were in, this is one of a bunch of studies, and they've been ongoing each year with the center when I was there. I only went to a public high school. That was my only experience at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So this is my first experience into private schooling. And in each of the schools, I was just blown away by the amount of this verbal sparring and using all these things that I knew I could not say, like racial remarks as jokes. There was just an openness to this type of bullying and hazing out the wazoo, not just for boys, also girls in some of these boarding schools. Mm-hmm. I think there's something about the context, even now working in public schools. Here, I played sports, and I felt like I connected to the men and masculinities literature and all the, but there's a different thing going on here, and it's even different than the public schools here in New York City. Although it's there, it's just
right, but not so extreme.
Yeah, and there's.
But you're saying that even the co-ed prep schools have the same.
Yeah, for sure, but I think
the prep school rather than the single sex.
Yeah, I don't think that it matters. I do think this is a culture that has a history of a very masculine-oriented. I think there's that, but I think it's still there. But I think there's something particularly about verbal sparring and teasing that's connected to intelligence in some of these schools, and that gets linked.
It's also very British. The British
model.
Yeah, right. The other thing I just wanted to say was I was very involved with a peer education program, for credit, but sort of internship thing on sexual assault at our school, which had both men and women in it. And the men were not necessarily volunteers; they were often tapped by they were RAs, and they were tapped by the head of the RA supervisors, kind of to do this. And because he thought they were student leader type people, and we saw the same kind of sort of eye-open revelation. Oh my God, I can hardly stand to go to my fraternity meetings now and listen to how they talk about women, kinds of comments that you got. So that's not surprising to me.
Well, it's interesting you bring up sexualized violence. One of the things that I saw when I first went in there, I felt was sexualized type of physical violence amongst the boys, which I brought up as one of the continuum. And I wanted to fit it in there with physical, in the slashes. And I got voted out, and I talk about it in my own writing, but in the context of the school, they just didn't see it, or if they saw it, they didn't think that students would take it seriously and become a joke. But, for example, this game called ball tapping, where you go by and you slap young boys on the balls, or the better kind was if you went like this, it didn't actually tap them, but made them flinch. And so much so it had to be written into the handbook, and also people were wearing cuffs and these sorts of things, and other examples. But it seemed very clear to me that there was something going on that was connected somehow. But that was one step too far.
So I actually went to probably the closest thing that you can get to this in Missouri.
That's why you were nodding your head. You know about ball tapping.
Yeah, there was way too much of that when I was in school. But yeah, so I went to a private all-boys Catholic school in St. Louis, and I was nodding pretty much during your entire presentation. Yeah.
You were not what?
Yeah, I was nodding pretty much during your entire presentation because
okay.
way too much of that resonates.
Okay.
But one of the things that that especially resonated and that I also find particularly interesting about the school that I went to is the incredible contradiction between this sense of moral high ground and this sort of viciousness that is institutionally nurtured in the students. So, like, because my school was Catholic, our motto was "Men for Others," and yet we also had teachers who would tally the put-downs on the board.
I thought that was. See, there's transferability in the qualitative validity sense.
Yeah, so at the, you know, at the bell before class begins, you have 2 minutes of silence for prayer, and then right after prayer, you have a put-down, and it goes up on the board.
See, that's so
Like,
interesting.
You're spending your 2 minutes thinking of your
Yeah,
birthday.
I never heard
exactly.
that. That is
Really,
Great for the
please, God, give me something witty to say.
But so the two teachers that did it at the school that I went to were both English teachers, and they both sort of thought of it sort of as in the tradition of Shakespeare and Chaucer.
Yeah, right.
Like these were great thinkers, and they fostered it by through insults.
Right.
So that's what we're going to do here.
That's very interesting.
So,
I'm glad I heard that type of generalizability is welcome. I like to hear
it
that.
reaches all the way to Missouri.
Yeah.
I wondered if perhaps you could engage a little bit with Eric Anderson's work around inclusive masculinity, like where does that fit? Does that have any resonance? I didn't see much of it. I wondered if it's there in terms of different types of relationships, the warmth between like young boys and young men. Was that something that came through in your research at all? Like the warm, supportive and nurturing relationship?
Well, Michael Reichert, I mean, a lot of this came out of, really, Michael Reichert created this sort of space for boys that became, with other faculty members, a place to learn how to, and a safe space for expression of emotion and other things. And so, I think there's a lot of work going on within the school, particularly in places of inclusive masculinities. But as often is the case with so many things, I think it becomes ghettoized. It becomes the space for that. You come in, you take off your shield, you come in, you're able to now have these incredibly emotional connections and learn about, but then you're out and you're in, the dog-eat-dog world.
Are you familiar with Anderson's work?
A little bit, but I have to admit that we were focused on this one area, and I've been out for a while. I would imagine there's lots of different. I would imagine you could see it if you looked for it, but there were some clear things that were emerging that didn't allow me to respond too much.
I think this is the refutation of Anderson, actually.
Which is.
I mean, he argues that homophobia has basically fallen off a cliff because you have all these British rugby players in his university kiss each other on the lips and talk about how they love each other. And and we've read his book and in one of our seminars, and we felt that actually goes quite handily, as this bullying does with the reproduction of elite masculinity. That goes quite handily with the sort of reproduction of a hegemonic masculinity rather than a challenge to it. But we've had many. Eric has been in our department for a year, and then we've Skyped seminared with him about his book.
Because I see in the city that idea of no homo, but I love you, man. The way that you have to, I see that with my students all the time. The way you do this one thing to allow me to do another thing as a way to bridge it. So I don't know what he would say about that.
I have to say, in defense of no homo, I think it's an intermediate step.
Yeah.
If I say to you, Brett, that jacket is so gay, it's a way of saying distance. Now, I also then can say, nice jacket, no homo. Now, I've at least allowed myself the experience of aesthetic pleasure, then I have to back away from it. One day, I might even be able to just say, nice jacket.
I agree.
So I think it's an intermediate step.
I like that. I like that hopefulness. Yeah.
I stepped out the room for a second at the beginning of the question, so I'm not sure if this was already asked. But I'm really curious about the fact that these teachers have a very much a lower status than the parents of these kids. And I'm wondering how that difference may affect the sort of laissez-faire attitude that they have in not necessarily disciplining them and having to call or write to whatever, these very intimidating, powerful parents to tell them about their kid being naughty. So that was one of my curiosities. And then the other one was about how much these teachers may actually want the validation of being liked, being the popular teacher in the eyes of these children of very powerful people. So that
that's
was
complicated.
So at my high school, the English teacher also kind of cultivated a classroom where there was a lot of teasing that was permitted. He was a football coach on the campus, as were all the English teachers at my high school. They were all the football coaches.
Oh, how weird. I'm sorry, but
very obviously cared about being liked by the popular boys. And that type of, anywhere you see that a teacher really cares about being liked by the students, can foster that type of environment. And so because of this status difference between the teachers and who it is that's in the classroom, or at least who their parents are, I feel like it would possibly lend to it more than in other environments.
I have a couple of thoughts. It's hard to answer, simply because I didn't do enough interviews with faculty. But I've been around a lot of schools and this one for a lot of years. So I can say this. Yes, the parents have a lot of power, so do the alumni in these schools. And some of the parents are well known, and so I think there could be some of that. I think there could be some celebrity. I wasn't aware of any celebrities in this case, but you know, some of the admiration for wealth and power. But what I saw more of was women in this institution having the role of being mother. The emotional work within the larger institution was imposed on the women faculty to be the ones when students ultimately did break down and cry for one thing or another to caretake, you know, to do that sort of labor. And so I found with the faculty that I worked with that particularly the 3 female faculty, they were like mothers to a lot of the, you know, their classrooms were open, the students would come in and have conversations, and that became a safe space to, you know, express things that they wouldn't express to their peers. And in fact, I heard this from interviews with students where they felt like with a single-sex institution and some of the messages that they were getting, that if you want to do real work, you do it with other boys. But if you want to talk about emotions, you do that with girls. And so, and I think, you know, that's one of the implicit messages of a single-sex institution, potentially. But I don't know that I can answer the other. But did I get enough of it in? Or did you have a follow-up question? I don't know that I was able to answer.
I know that you can't answer it. I just
it's
wanted
a
to
good
bring it
thought.
up as another possible sort of behind-the-scenes power discrepancy going on that could be influencing this.
And the disrespect that students have for faculty. I mean, I think there's something.
They don't want that job.
Yeah. Well,
they don't want to be a teacher at a private school. That's not their aspiration. That's not why they're paying.
They tend to be very accomplished, and they have a lot of freedom in that accomplishment. You know, they can. It's like a college classroom. They don't use textbooks. They use like, but they only have 1 year. It's 1 year at a time. So there's a lot riding on their contract. It's what's that? Yeah, and so some of that matters, and so I can totally imagine her having been looking for that. Sorry, go ahead.
Several comments, but I'll try to make it quick.
No,
I agree with what you said. I went to an elite public school in the Midwest where I was coach on social studies, not English. And there is, I think that dynamic of wanting to be liked in that kind of teacher's own, you know, basking in the reflected status of the students is a really important dynamic, and I think it might help explain some of the things going on. Certainly it looked familiar to me, and I mean, it was interesting that what you described, and I was also thinking about LaBeouf writing about playing the dozens. This is way back, but in Harlem, and so I just wanted to point that out. I mean, there are a lot of things that, you know, cross geographical and class and race lines there that might be interesting to look at. And
can I just say something
Yeah.
to you? But
Yeah.
the hegemony, unlike my public school, was not around sports. As you had mentioned, the coach and all that. I found that interesting. Everyone has to play a sport as part of the moral kind of upbringing of the school. And so the hegemony and the power and hierarchy revolved around just being good at something and the power of that, whatever it was. And that I'd never seen that before. Just to so you wanted to, then you had nothing. And
then just the last thing, that apropos of what Michael said in terms of your second hypothesis and some of the tensions, I think if you don't know the Victor Turner, the ritual process on rites of passage, it really speaks to all of those issues, because it looks at the tensions between community and hierarchy, and also what you said, the kind of use of a rite of passage and the fact of going through hardship to justify high status.
Again? Victor Turner.
Victor Turner
process.
Yeah, Victor Turner, the ritual process. Because I taught for 1 year at Swarthmore, and now I'm at a very different place, and I can see it so clearly. The Swarthmore students, despite being very PC and cool and all of that, they actually played what they called misery poker. I don't know where they got the name, where they compete to see who was more miserable. And the goal of it was that there was a kind of, there was a definite sense that if you were miserable and you were suffering, that justified the high status that you were probably going to get, you know, after you graduated.
I think that's
so
really
interesting.
there's something to that.
That is interesting. So I'm going to have to check that out.
And I haven't
But
seen that at Dowling.
But the social psychologist at NYU who had the rigged Monopoly game, it just opens up, I think, as a psychologist, it opens up lots of different opportunities to sort of see that process in action.
I know what you're talking about, and I hadn't thought of that, but now I have to.
And what's the name of that book about the elite, about St. Paul's? Do you know
St. Paul's? Yeah. And he's up at Columbia, right?
Right.
Yeah, James Conn.
Yeah. Right. Now that's a really interesting argument, because he argues that for St. Paul's is as elite a prep school as you can get.
That was one of the
in
schools
US.
within the consortium, actually.
So, and what he argues is that once upon a time, St. Paul's was all George H.W. Bush. It was all, you know, the old blue bloods, and they were quite aware of their elite status, very aware of it, because because there weren't any women or blacks or Jews or anything but probably a few Catholics. And then what happened was the school opened up to minorities and to women and to and so it became somewhat of a class-based but still meritocracy. And now these same kids whose grandfathers would leave with a sense of noblesse oblige, like, yes, we are the elite, we have to do good work for those below us. Now they come out feeling quite entitled because they believe that they've succeeded in a meritocracy.
I think there's something to that.
That's a very clever argument, I think. That's a really, you probably read that, huh, Marcus? It's a really clever book, I think. Did you review it for? No.
Did you have a last?
Well, thank you for your talk. Sorry I missed half of it, but what I did hear I really enjoyed. And I just wanted to say I think that this, focusing on the class, and you said you were really interested in the economic class, and I think there's something really there. In the football comment, your distinction is what I really was trying to comment on, and I think that's a fabulous distinction because especially with football, that is a working class aspiration. So of course these men are more interested in being good at something else because that's not what they're aspiring for. So that's a very different dynamic, and it's manifesting, obviously, as you've shown us, in very different ways.
I think it's really,
That was just like a last comment on that. I don't know if you read the work by Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist. He did work on the same types of school in France. And
on
he would
masculinity.
talk about, say that the capital is relative to the field. So football doesn't have any symbolic capital within that area, but it's something else, and it doesn't really matter. But whatever capital is more variable, so you can turn it into a symbolic capital. I guess since these people probably own the football stadium, playing it is not owning it would be more relevant. It would be the thing that has the higher symbolic value or something. That could be a way of.
I know you've got to go.
No, I want to just thank you and join me in thanking you.